There was a city that refused to die. While empires crumbled into dust and kingdoms faded into legend, this city stood, not with defiance alone, but with memory. It remembered Rome when Rome had forgotten itself. It held the old language, the old laws, the old dream of eternal order, even as the world around it descended into shadow. For over 1,000 years, it carried the weight of a fallen empire on its shoulders, whispering to the darkness, "We are still here." This is the story of Byzantium, the city that outlived its own death, the empire that became a ghost and refused to vanish, the last flickering light of a world that once believed itself immortal. Tonight, as the stars settle into their ancient courses and the night grows soft around you, let us walk together through those marble halls, through those final centuries of defiance and grace, and remember what it meant to be the last of the Romans. If these words carry you gently toward sleep, if this story becomes a companion to your quiet hours, consider letting this channel stay by your side. A simple subscribe means these histories will continue to find you in the stillness, night after night, carrying you softly into rest. No urgency, no pressure, only an invitation to return whenever you need a story that understands the sacred rhythm of bedtime. There are places on this earth where history folds back on itself, where the past and future meet in a single breath of stone and sky. Constantinople was such a place. Built on 7 hills, like Rome before it, it rose where 2 continents touched, Europe on one shore, Asia on the other, and between them the narrow strait of the Bosphorus, where waters from 2 seas mingled and moved. The Greeks had known this spot for 1,000 years before Rome ever dreamed of empire. They had called it Byzantium, a trading post, a haven for merchants who understood that geography is destiny. And destiny had chosen this place for something greater than trade. When Constantine the Great looked upon these shores in the year 324, he saw what emperors see, not what is, but what could be. Rome, the eternal city, was dying. Not in fire or conquest, but in something quieter and more terrible, exhaustion. The West was bleeding from barbarian raids, political chaos, economic collapse. The heart of the empire had grown weak. But the East still thrummed with life. Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, these cities held wealth, culture, learning. The eastern provinces were where the future lived, and Constantine understood that to save Rome, he would have to leave it behind. So he chose this place, this meeting point of worlds, and he made it new. He drew the boundaries himself, walking the hills with a spear in hand, marking the limits of what would become the greatest city the medieval world would ever know. His advisors grew nervous as he walked farther and farther, expanding the circuit of the walls beyond all reason. "How much farther, Augustus?" they asked. And Constantine, his eyes fixed on something only he could see, replied, "Until the one who walks before me tells me to stop." Whether he meant God or vision or simply ambition, no one dared to ask. The construction began with a fervor that bordered on obsession. Columns were brought from temples across the empire. Statues that had stood for centuries in Athens and Ephesus were uprooted and carried across the sea. Constantine wanted his new capital to rival Rome in every way, in grandeur, in sacred power, in the weight of history itself. He built forums and aqueducts, palaces and bathhouses. He constructed the Hippodrome, where 250,000 people could gather to watch chariot races that became more than sport, they became politics, religion, tribal identity, all woven into the thunder of hooves and the roar of crowds. The city rose rapidly, almost supernaturally, as if the earth itself was eager to birth this new Rome into being. But Constantine understood something that mere architects could not grasp. A city is not made of marble alone. It needs a soul, and for Romans, that soul had always been twofold, power and faith. So Constantine made his city the seat of imperial authority, yes, but he also made it a Christian capital in a way Rome had never been. He built churches that gleamed with gold and precious stones. He brought relics from across the Christian world, fragments of the true cross, the nails that had pierced Christ's hands, the robe of the Virgin Mary. Constantinople would not just be the capital of an empire. It would be the sacred heart of Christendom, the city where heaven and earth were closest, where the divine right of emperors was not merely claimed but made manifest in stone and prayer. On May 11, 330, the city was formally dedicated. The ceremonies lasted for 40 days, echoing the biblical pattern of transformation and renewal. Priests blessed the walls. Soldiers paraded through streets still smelling of fresh mortar and paint. And Constantine stood at the center of it all, declaring that this place, this new Rome, this Constantinople, would stand forever. It was a bold claim, perhaps an arrogant one. But the city would make him a prophet. And yet, even in that moment of triumph, there was something the emperor could not have foreseen. He had built this city to save Rome, to preserve the empire by transplanting it to stronger soil. But in doing so, he had created something that was no longer quite Roman. The language here was Greek. The culture was Eastern. The Christianity that flourished in these streets would grow increasingly different from the Latin West, shaped by Greek philosophy and Eastern mysticism in ways that Rome would eventually find strange and threatening. Constantine had built a bridge between two worlds, but bridges do not belong fully to either shore. Constantinople would become its own thing, hybrid, peculiar, neither east nor west but somehow both and neither. And that strange in-between quality would become both its greatest strength and its deepest curse. The emperors who followed Constantine inherited more than a city. They inherited a paradox. They ruled an empire that still called itself Roman, that still venerated the old Senate, that still proclaimed the eternal authority of Rome, and yet Rome itself had become a distant memory, a place of crumbling monuments and fading relevance. The true power now resided here, in Constantinople, where the palace complex sprawled across acres of perfumed gardens and marble corridors, where the emperor sat upon a throne that could be raised and lowered by hidden machinery, creating the illusion that he ascended toward heaven itself when granting audiences. It was theater, yes, but theater that served a purpose. In Byzantium, power was not just wielded, it was performed, ritualized, made sacred through ceremony so elaborate that it seemed to place the emperor halfway between man and God. The city itself became a work of art that never finished evolving. Each emperor added to it, trying to outdo his predecessors, trying to prove his worthiness to wear the purple. Libraries were built, their shelves groaning under the weight of scrolls and codices, the works of Homer and Plato, the histories of Herodotus and Thucydides, the philosophical treatises that the Western world was beginning to forget. Here, in Constantinople, they were copied and studied and debated in academies where Greek was not a dead language but the living tongue of scholars and saints. The university that grew in the city's heart became a beacon for anyone who still believed that knowledge mattered, that the old wisdom was worth preserving even as the world outside descended into what later ages would call the Dark Ages. But wisdom alone does not defend walls. As the 5th century progressed, the western half of the empire began its final, terrible collapse. One by one, the provinces fell away. Britain was abandoned to Saxon invaders. Gaul became a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms. Spain fell to the Visigoths. North Africa to the Vandals. And in 476, a date that would haunt history textbooks forever after, the last Western emperor, a boy with the ironic name Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain who didn't even bother to claim the title for himself. Rome, the eternal city, the empire that had conquered the known world, simply ceased to exist as a political entity. The fall came not with trumpets and drama, but with a whimper, a shrug, an exhausted acceptance that the end had finally arrived. And yet, in Constantinople, the sun still rose over the domes and spires. The Senate still met. The emperor still ruled. And the people of Byzantium looked westward at the ruins of Rome and said, quietly but firmly, we are still here. We are still Roman. The empire has not fallen. It has merely relocated. This was not denial. It was transformation. Byzantium became the keeper of a flame that had guttered out everywhere else. It preserved Roman law when barbarian kingdoms governed by custom and the whims of warlords. It maintained Roman administrative structures when the West fragmented into feudal chaos. It kept alive the dream of universal order, of a single empire under God, even when that dream had become more memory than reality. The language began to shift, gradually and then all at once. Latin, the tongue of Cicero and Caesar, gave way to Greek. Not because Greek was foreign, it had always been the language of the eastern provinces, the language of commerce and philosophy and daily life, but because the pretense of being Western Romans was becoming harder to maintain. By the 6th century, even official documents were being written in Greek. The transformation was complete, or nearly so. Byzantium was no longer Rome in exile. It was something new, something that had never existed before, a Greek empire that remembered Rome, a Christian state that drew on ancient pagan philosophy, an Eastern power that saw itself as the guardian of Western civilization. The contradictions were dizzying, but somehow, impossibly, they held together. The city continued to grow, swelling with refugees from the fallen West, with merchants from as far as India and China, with pilgrims who came to pray at the shrines where miracles were said to occur with startling regularity. The population reached heights that would not be seen again in Europe until the Industrial Revolution, perhaps 500,000 souls, perhaps more, packed into neighborhoods that ranged from palaces of breathtaking opulence to slums of desperate poverty. It was a city of extremes, where unimaginable wealth and grinding destitution lived side by side, separated by a single wall or a narrow street. Beggars slept in the shadows of churches whose interiors glowed with mosaics made from thousands of tiny golden tiles, each one catching the candlelight and throwing it back in shimmering waves that seemed almost alive. And at the heart of it all, the emperor ruled with a power that was absolute in theory but precarious in practice. For Byzantium had inherited not just Rome's glory but also its greatest weakness: the throne was not strictly hereditary. Any man who could seize it and hold it might become emperor, regardless of birth or lineage. This created a culture of constant intrigue, of plots and counterplots, of poisonings and palace coups that became as much a part of Byzantine life as the liturgy itself. Emperors rose from the ranks of the army, from the bureaucracy, even from the common people. And they fell just as quickly, blinded or exiled or strangled in dark rooms while the city outside went about its business, barely pausing to notice that the ruler had changed. It was brutal and efficient and strangely democratic in its way. Power went to whoever could claim it and whoever could convince enough people that his rule was divinely ordained. The church, meanwhile, grew in influence until it became inseparable from the state itself. The Patriarch of Constantinople was second only to the emperor, and sometimes not even that. Religious disputes became political crises. Theological debates could spark riots in the streets. The question of whether Christ had one nature or two, whether icons should be venerated or destroyed, whether the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father alone or from the Father and the Son, these were not abstract academic exercises. They were battles for the soul of the empire, and people died for them, killed for them, went to war over them. Faith in Byzantium was not a private matter. It was the glue that held the empire together, the shared language that united Greek and Armenian, Syrian and Egyptian, rich and poor under one God, one empire, one eternal truth. And so the city stood, poised between two worlds and belonging fully to neither, carrying forward the memory of Rome while becoming something Rome had never been. It was a place of scholars and soldiers, of merchants and monks, of emperors who saw themselves as God's chosen and peasants who believed that heaven itself watched over their city with particular care. The walls rose high and strong, built to withstand any siege. The harbor filled with ships from every corner of the known world. And the people of Constantinople looked out from their 7 hills and believed, truly believed, that their city would stand forever. They could not know, in those early centuries, how many times that belief would be tested. How many enemies would come. How close the city would come to falling, again and again. How the empire would shrink and swell and shrink again across the centuries, like a tide that never quite reached the shore it once touched. But for now, in these years when Rome had fallen and Byzantium had risen, there was still hope. There was still strength. There was still the dream that an empire could be eternal if it refused, absolutely refused, to die. The streets of Constantinople hummed with a vitality that was both magnificent and overwhelming. To walk through the Misi, the great central avenue that ran from the Golden Gate to the heart of the city, was to journey through a living encyclopedia of human ambition and desire. Merchants spread their wares beneath awnings of colored silk, spices from India that filled the air with scents of cinnamon and cardamom, carpets from Persia woven with patterns that seemed to shift in the sunlight, ivory from Africa carved into chess pieces and devotional crosses, amber from the distant Baltic that glowed like captured sunlight. The money changers sat at their tables, weighing coins from a dozen kingdoms, calculating exchange rates with an expertise born of necessity in a city where commerce was as sacred as prayer. Above the noise of bargaining and the clatter of carts on stone, church bells rang out the hours. Constantinople had more churches than any city had a right to possess. Some said there were more than 400 scattered through its neighborhoods, from tiny chapels tucked into alleyways to soaring basilicas that dominated entire districts. Each morning, the faithful poured into these sacred spaces, lighting candles before icons painted on gold backgrounds that made the saints and martyrs seem to float in a realm beyond the physical world. The liturgy chanted in these churches was not the spare, simple worship that had characterized early Christianity. It had grown elaborate, mysterious, heavy with incense and symbolism, a ritual so complex that it required years of study to master. To attend the divine liturgy in one of Constantinople's great churches was to be transported, if only for an hour, into a vision of heaven itself. The emperor, meanwhile, lived behind walls within walls, in the great palace that was less a single building than an entire city unto itself. It sprawled across terraces that descended toward the Sea of Marmara, a labyrinth of throne rooms and private chapels, reception halls and hidden gardens where fountains played among fruit trees brought from distant provinces. The palace had its own harbor, its own churches, its own barracks for the imperial guard. It was said that an emperor could live his entire life within these walls without once stepping into the city beyond, and some nearly did. The palace protocol was so intricate that entire manuals were written to govern every aspect of imperial life: how the emperor should walk, how he should be addressed, who could stand in his presence and who must prostrate themselves, what robes he should wear for each occasion, what phrases he should speak during ceremonies that had been performed the same way for generations. This obsession with ritual was not mere vanity. It served a crucial purpose in an empire where the emperor's authority rested not on hereditary right but on the belief that he was chosen by God, that he ruled as Christ's regent on earth. Every ceremony, every carefully choreographed entrance and exit, reinforced this divine mandate. When foreign ambassadors came to the court, they were subjected to a theatrical display designed to overwhelm and intimidate. They would be led through seemingly endless corridors, each more magnificent than the last, until they reached the throne room where the emperor sat in robes so heavy with gold thread and precious stones that he could barely move. Mechanical lions flanked the throne, roaring through hidden pipes. Golden birds sang in golden trees. And the throne itself would slowly rise, lifting the emperor higher and higher until the ambassadors, prostrate on the floor, could barely see him through the incense smoke and the dazzle of reflected light. It was meant to suggest that the emperor dwelt in a realm between earth and heaven, and by all accounts, it worked magnificently. Yet beneath this glittering surface, the empire faced challenges that no amount of ceremony could solve. The treasury, despite the wealth flowing through Constantinople's ports, was perpetually strained. The army required constant funding. The bureaucracy had grown so vast and complex that corruption was not an aberration but a structural feature. Every position had its price, every favor its cost. Officials who arrived in the provinces with modest means could return to the capital as wealthy men, their fortunes built on taxes skimmed and bribes accepted. The system tolerated this up to a point, understanding that a certain amount of corruption was the grease that kept the imperial machine functioning. But when it went too far, when provincial governors began to act like independent rulers, the emperor would strike with sudden brutality: confiscations, exiles, executions that served as reminders that power in Byzantium ultimately flowed from one source alone. The people, meanwhile, divided themselves in ways that might have seemed absurd to outsiders but were deadly serious within the city walls. The chariot racing factions, the blues and the greens primarily, were far more than sports fans. They were political parties, religious movements, and street gangs all woven together. To declare yourself a blue or a green was to take a position on everything from theology to imperial policy. The factions had their own territories within the city, their own leaders, their own militias. When tensions rose, the streets could erupt into violence that left hundreds dead. And yet the races continued, week after week, at the hippodrome, because they served as a pressure valve for a population that had no other outlet for political expression. The emperor watched from his kathisma, the imperial box that connected directly to the palace, and the crowd's reactions, their cheers or their silence, their chants or their jeers, told him how his policies were being received more accurately than any report from his ministers. Women in Byzantium occupied a strange space, simultaneously constrained and powerful. By law and custom, they were expected to remain largely invisible in public life, especially women of the upper classes who rarely appeared in public without veils and who lived in separate quarters within their homes. And yet, Byzantine history was shaped by empresses who wielded power that would have been unthinkable in most other societies. They could not officially rule as emperors themselves, the title was masculine, reserved for men, but as empress mothers, empress wives, empress regents, they could and did control the machinery of state. Some were celebrated as saints after their deaths. Others were condemned as scheming manipulators who had led emperors astray. But all of them understood that in a system where power was personal rather than institutional, where everything depended on proximity to the throne, a woman who had the emperor's ear had more real authority than senators who held ancient titles but no imperial favor. The city's walls, meanwhile, stood as the ultimate guarantor of Byzantine survival. The Theodosian walls, built in the early 5th century and stretching for miles from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn, were perhaps the most formidable fortifications ever constructed. 3 lines of defense, a moat, an outer wall, and a massive inner wall studded with towers, made Constantinople virtually impregnable to any army using the siege technology of the time. Attackers would have to cross the moat under fire, breach the outer wall while defenders rained arrows and stones from the towers, and then somehow scale or break through the inner wall that rose 40 feet high and was 15 feet thick at its base. It had never been done. Armies had tried and failed, leaving their bones scattered in the killing ground between the walls. The people of Constantinople took fierce pride in their walls, understanding that stone and mortar were the only things standing between their civilization and the chaos that had consumed the West. And so the city endured, through the 5th century and into the 6th, a beacon of order in an age of dissolution. It was not perfect, no human creation ever is. It was brutal when it needed to be, corrupt in ways both small and large, rigid in its hierarchies and suspicious of innovation. But it worked. It provided stability in a world where stability had become rare. It preserved knowledge when knowledge was being lost. It maintained the conviction that civilization itself was worth fighting for, worth bleeding for, worth the endless compromises and sacrifices that empire demanded. The people who walked its streets, who prayed in its churches, who haggled in its markets and gossiped in its bathhouses, believed they lived in the center of the world. And in many ways, they were right. Constantinople had become what Rome had once been, the city that mattered, the place where history was being written in golden letters on pages that would endure long after empires that seemed stronger had crumbled into dust. In the year 527, a man who should never have become emperor ascended to the throne of Byzantium. His name was Justinian, and everything about him defied the expectations of what a Roman emperor should be. He was not born to the purple, not raised in the palace with tutors and protocols designed to mold him for rule. He came from nothing, a peasant village in Illyria, a place so remote and poor that its name barely registered in imperial records. His native language was not Greek or Latin but a rough Thracian dialect. His uncle had been a swineherd before joining the army and rising, through a combination of luck and ruthlessness, to become emperor himself. And when that uncle, Justin, grew old and needed an heir, he chose Justinian, the nephew he had brought to Constantinople as a boy, the one who had proven himself clever and ambitious and absolutely tireless in his pursuit of power. Justinian was not handsome. Contemporary accounts describe him as average in height, with a round face that could appear kind or cruel depending on the light and his mood. He rarely slept, working through the night on legal documents and military dispatches, surviving on a few hours of rest that he took sitting upright in a chair. His mind was restless, brilliant, constantly spinning with plans and visions of what the empire could become if only he pushed hard enough, if only he refused to accept the diminished state that history seemed to have decreed. He looked at the map of the Mediterranean and saw not what was, but what had been, the old Roman Empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. And he believed, with a fervor that bordered on religious conviction, that it could be restored. That it must be restored. That God had placed him on the throne for precisely this purpose. Beside him stood a woman who was, if anything, even more remarkable. Theodora had been an actress, which in Byzantine society was only slightly more respectable than being a prostitute. The two professions often overlapped in the theaters and hippodromes where she had performed. The sources that have survived are divided between those who saw her as a saint and those who painted her as a demon, but all agree that she was extraordinary. Beautiful, yes, but more than that, intelligent, ruthless when necessary, and possessed of a will that matched Justinian's own. Their marriage had scandalized Constantinople's elite. A peasant emperor was one thing, but an actress empress? It violated every convention, every expectation of how power should be transferred and legitimized. And yet Justinian had insisted, and Theodora had proven herself indispensable, not as ornament but as partner. She attended councils. She received ambassadors. She made policy decisions that were obeyed as if they came from the emperor himself. Together, they formed a partnership that would shape the empire for decades and leave scars that would never fully heal. The first years of Justinian's reign were consumed with legal reform. He had inherited a system of Roman law that had grown over centuries into a tangled mess of contradictions and obsolete statutes. Laws from the Republic still technically applied alongside decrees from emperors dead for 300 years. Lawyers spent their careers memorizing precedents and counter-precedents, finding loopholes and obscure clauses that could be twisted to serve any purpose. Justinian looked at this chaos and saw an opportunity for immortality more lasting than any military conquest. He appointed a commission led by his brilliant legal minister, Tribonian, and gave them an impossible task: compile, organize, and codify the entire body of Roman law into a single, coherent system. The work took years, but when it was finished, it was magnificent. The Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, would become one of the most influential documents in human history. It preserved legal principles that would shape Western civilization for over a millennium: the presumption of innocence, the right to a defense, the distinction between public and private law, the concept that justice should be consistent and predictable rather than arbitrary. Universities across medieval Europe would study these texts as if they were scripture. Modern legal systems would build their foundations on principles first articulated in Justinian's code. It was, in its way, a conquest more complete than any achieved with armies. Roman law would govern territories that Roman legions never reached, would shape societies that didn't even know they were following Byzantine precedents. Justinian understood this, understood that law was empire written in a language that could transcend the rise and fall of kingdoms. But law alone did not satisfy his hunger for glory. Justinian wanted the world to see the majesty of his reign made manifest in stone and gold and light. And so he built. The old church of Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom, had burned in riots that nearly toppled him from the throne in the early years of his rule. Rather than simply rebuild it, Justinian decided to create something that had never been seen before, something that would make people believe they had stepped into heaven itself when they crossed its threshold. He summoned the greatest architects and engineers of the age and gave them resources that seemed unlimited. "Build me a church," he said, "that will make all who see it understand the glory of God and the power of the empire that serves him." The construction took 5 years and employed 10,000 workers. The scale was staggering. The dome that crowned the building spanned more than 100 feet and seemed to float in the air, supported by pendentives, curved triangular sections, that distributed its weight in ways that defied intuition. Light poured through windows set around the dome's base, creating the illusion that it rested on nothing but beams of sunlight. The interior was covered in mosaics of such intricate beauty that even enemies of the empire, seeing them for the first time, fell silent. Gold and silver, emerald and amethyst, mother of pearl and lapis lazuli, the materials came from across the known world, assembled into images of angels and saints and the face of Christ Pantocrator, Christ the all-powerful, staring down from the dome's apex with eyes that seemed to follow you wherever you walked. When it was completed in 537, Justinian entered the church alone. He walked the length of the nave, his footsteps echoing in the vast space, and then stood beneath the dome, looking up at the play of light and shadow, at the way the building seemed to transform solid matter into something ethereal and divine. And there, in that moment, he spoke words that would be remembered forever: "Solomon, I have surpassed you." It was not mere boast. The temple in Jerusalem had been legendary for its magnificence, but it had been destroyed twice, and existed now only in memory and yearning. Hagia Sophia was real, solid, present, a declaration in marble and gold that Byzantium had achieved something even the greatest kings of Israel had not been able to preserve. But buildings, no matter how glorious, do not restore empires. For that, Justinian needed armies, and the army he inherited was a shadow of the legions that had once conquered the world. The professional soldiers of old Rome had given way to a mixture of hired mercenaries, frontier limitanii who were more farmers than fighters, and barbarian federati whose loyalty lasted only as long as the gold continued to flow. Yet within this patchwork force, Justinian found the commanders he needed. Men like Belisarius, a general of such tactical brilliance that he would win battles against armies 5 times the size of his own. Men like Narses, an elderly eunuch who seemed an unlikely warrior but who understood logistics and strategy with a precision that bordered on genius. With these men, Justinian believed he could do the impossible. He could reconquer the West. The Vandal kingdom in North Africa was the first target. For a century, these Germanic invaders had ruled the former Roman provinces, building a naval power that raided the Mediterranean coast with impunity. They had even sacked Rome itself in 455, loading ships with treasures including, it was said, the golden menorah from the temple in Jerusalem that had been brought to Rome by Titus 5 centuries before. Justinian saw their kingdom as both a threat and an opportunity, a chance to prove that Byzantine power could reach across the sea, that the age of barbarian ascendancy was ending. In 533, he sent Belisarius with an expeditionary force that was smaller than many had urged, but Justinian trusted his general's abilities more than he trusted raw numbers. The campaign was swift, almost miraculous. Belisarius landed in North Africa and defeated the Vandals in 2 decisive battles. Within a year, the kingdom had collapsed. Its king was captured and brought to Constantinople in chains, paraded through the streets in a triumph that deliberately echoed the ancient Roman ceremonies of conquest. The menorah from Jerusalem was displayed again, carried through the same city where it had been brought by Vespasian's legions. For a moment, it seemed as if time itself had folded backward, as if the old empire had never fallen but had merely been sleeping, waiting for the right emperor to awaken it. North Africa was Roman again, its grain fields restored to the imperial economy, its shores secured against piracy. Justinian had proven that reconquest was possible. Italy came next, and here the dream began to sour. The Ostrogothic kingdom that ruled the peninsula had maintained a careful balance, barbarian in ethnicity but Roman in administration, tolerant of the Catholic Church while practicing Arian Christianity themselves. They had preserved much of what had made Italy great, and their king, Theodoric, had been celebrated as a just and effective ruler. But Theodoric was dead, and his successors lacked his gifts. When Justinian's armies invaded in 535, many Italians welcomed them as liberators, believing that the restoration of imperial rule would bring security and prosperity. They could not have been more wrong. The Gothic War dragged on for nearly 20 years, transforming from a campaign of liberation into a war of annihilation that left Italy broken and bleeding. Cities that had stood since before Rome itself were razed to the ground. Rome changed hands 5 times, its population fleeing or dying until the Eternal City became almost a ghost town. The aqueducts that had supplied water for 1 million people were cut. The Gothic defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew they were facing extermination. And the Byzantine armies, underfunded and increasingly bitter, lived off the land in ways indistinguishable from looting. Fields went unplanted. Trade collapsed. Famine stalked the countryside like a specter more terrible than any army. Belisarius won brilliant victories, capturing Ravenna and seeming to bring the war to a close. But Justinian, paranoid and jealous, recalled him before the job was finished, unable to tolerate a general who became too successful, too celebrated. The war reignited. New Gothic leaders emerged who fought with renewed ferocity. And when Narses finally, truly ended the conflict in 552, what he delivered to Justinian was not the prosperous, intact province the emperor had dreamed of, but a wasteland. Italy would not recover for generations. The reconquest had succeeded, technically, but at a cost that made victory almost indistinguishable from defeat. Spain followed, a campaign in the south that secured a foothold but never achieved the total conquest Justinian envisioned. And with each victory, no matter how limited, the empire's resources stretched thinner. The treasury, despite the wealth of Constantinople and the restored North African grain, could not sustain wars on multiple fronts indefinitely. Taxes rose to crushing levels. Provinces that had once prospered found themselves squeezed for every coin, and when they could not pay, imperial officials arrived with threats and punishments that bred resentment rather than loyalty. The reconquered territories cost more to hold than they generated in revenue. But Justinian could not stop. To stop would be to admit that the dream was impossible, that Rome truly was dead and could not be resurrected through will and ambition alone. Then came the plague. It arrived in 541, carried on grain ships from Egypt, and it spread through Constantinople with a speed that seemed almost supernatural. The symptoms were horrific: fever and delirium, swellings in the groin and armpits that grew to the size of apples, black marks on the skin that gave the disease its later name, the bubonic plague. People died by the thousands, then tens of thousands. The bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Justinian himself fell ill, and for days the empire held its breath, waiting to see if the emperor would survive. He did, but he was never quite the same afterward, more withdrawn, more suspicious, more prone to see divine punishment in every setback. The plague returned again and again over the following decades, each wave killing more people, hollowing out the empire's population until entire regions were depopulated. Farms lay abandoned. Cities shrank within their walls. The army could not recruit enough soldiers. The tax base collapsed even as expenses continued to climb. Modern estimates suggest that the plague killed between 1/4 of the empire's population, tens of millions of people dying in one of the greatest catastrophes in human history. And through it all, Justinian continued to push forward with his projects, his wars, his determination to restore Rome no matter the cost. Theodora died in 548, cancer consuming her body while Justinian watched helplessly. She had been more than his wife, she had been his conscience, his counterweight, the one person who could tell him hard truths without fear. Without her, something essential broke in the emperor. He grew more rigid, more obsessed with theological disputes that seemed to matter only to him, more willing to persecute those whose interpretation of Christian doctrine differed from his own. Heresy trials multiplied. Monasteries were emptied or filled depending on which side of obscure theological debates they fell. The energy that should have gone to governance was poured into arguments about the nature of Christ's will, about whether certain ancient theologians had been heretics or saints, about questions that seemed absurd even to many believers but that Justinian treated as matters of eternal consequence. The empire that Justinian left behind when he finally died in 565 was larger than the one he had inherited, but it was also fundamentally weaker. The map looked impressive: North Africa restored, Italy reclaimed, a foothold in Spain secured. The borders stretched almost as far as they had in the glory days of the Antonine emperors. But maps lie. They show territory without revealing the exhaustion of the people who inhabit it, the emptiness of treasuries, the brittleness of institutions pushed beyond their breaking point. Justinian had achieved his reconquest, but he had purchased it with resources the empire did not have, borrowed against a future that could not sustain the debt. The military establishment that had won these victories was already fraying at its edges. The soldiers who had fought for Belisarius and Narses were growing old, and their replacements were harder to find and train. The plague had not just killed civilians, it had devastated military recruitment, leaving commanders scrambling to fill the ranks with whoever they could find. Foreign mercenaries made up an increasing proportion of the army, men who fought for pay rather than loyalty, who would desert or switch sides if a better offer appeared. The old discipline, the esprit de corps that had made Roman legions feared across the world, was becoming a memory maintained more through nostalgia than reality. The provinces, meanwhile, groaned under the weight of taxation that would have been unsustainable even without the plague. Justinian's bureaucracy extracted every coin it could, and when coins ran out, it took payment in kind, grain, livestock, labor. The people who had welcomed Byzantine armies as liberators in Italy now looked back with bitter longing to the Gothic kings who had at least allowed them to keep enough to survive. In North Africa, Berber tribes who had been marginalized by the Vandals saw no reason to accept Byzantine rule either, and they began a long, grinding insurgency that would drain imperial resources for decades. The reconquered territories were not healing wounds, they were open sores that would not stop bleeding. Yet even as his empire strained and cracked, Justinian never stopped building. Churches continued to rise across Constantinople and in every major city, each one a declaration that Byzantine wealth and piety exceeded anything the barbarian kingdoms could imagine. Monasteries multiplied, filled with monks who spent their days in prayer and copying manuscripts, preserving knowledge but producing nothing the state could tax or the army could use. The emperor himself became increasingly monastic in his habits, fasting until his health suffered, spending hours in devotion while dispatches piled up unread. He had always believed he ruled by divine mandate, but as he aged and the problems multiplied, that belief hardened into something darker, a conviction that every setback was a test of faith, every critic an agent of demonic forces seeking to undermine God's plan. The theological disputes that consumed Justinian's final years would have been comic if they had not caused such real suffering. At issue was a doctrine called the Three Chapters, writings by theologians long dead, whose orthodoxy was suddenly, inexplicably, crucial to the emperor. Justinian wanted them condemned. The Pope, reluctantly, agreed. But the condemnation sparked outrage in parts of the Church that saw it as an attack on the Council of Chalcedon, the great assembly that had defined Christian doctrine 2 centuries earlier. Bishops were exiled. Monasteries revolted. In northern Italy, where Byzantine rule was already resented, the theological dispute became a rallying point for opposition that would fester for generations. Justinian had meant to unify the Church, to bring all Christians under a single, pure doctrine. Instead, he deepened divisions and created new heresies where none had existed before. His relationship with the people of Constantinople itself grew strained in ways that would have been unthinkable in the early, glorious years of his reign. The Nika riots of 532 had nearly destroyed him, a week of violence that left tens of thousands dead and half the city in flames. He had survived only because Theodora convinced him not to flee, told him it was better to die an emperor than live as a fugitive. The riots had been suppressed with savage brutality, the hippodrome turned into an abattoir where soldiers cut down men, women, and children by the thousands. The memory of that violence hung over the city like smoke that never quite cleared. People still cheered at the races, still gathered for imperial ceremonies, but the spontaneous love that subjects sometimes feel for their rulers had curdled into something more complex, fear mixed with respect, obedience without affection. Justinian's final years were marked by a kind of lonely grandeur. He worked tirelessly, still believing he could fix everything if he just pushed hard enough, if he just found the right law or the right theological formula or the right military strategy. But the problems had grown beyond any one man's capacity to solve them. The Persians, who had been mostly quiet during the early years of his reign, sensed Byzantine weakness and began probing attacks along the eastern frontier. Slavic tribes poured into the Balkans, settling in lands that had been Roman for centuries, introducing a demographic shift that would permanently alter the character of the region. The empire was defending on too many fronts, stretched too thin, hemorrhaging resources and lives to maintain territories that brought little return. When death finally came to Justinian in November of 565, it must have been almost a relief. He was 83 years old, ancient by the standards of his age, and he had reigned for 38 years, longer than most of his subjects had been alive. The state funeral was magnificent, as befitted the emperor who had restored Rome's glory, who had built Hagia Sophia, who had codified Roman law for eternity. The mourning was genuine, for whatever his failures, Justinian had been a towering figure, a man of vision and relentless energy. But mixed with the grief was something else, a quiet exhalation, a sense that perhaps now, finally, the empire could rest. His successors inherited an impossible situation. Justin II, who followed him, tried to maintain the aggressive policies but lacked the resources to do so. Within years, he suffered a mental breakdown, reportedly running through the palace halls screaming while servants chased him trying to calm him down. The reconquered territories began to slip away almost immediately. The Lombards invaded Italy and carved out a kingdom in the north that Byzantium would never dislodge. Spain was lost within decades. Even North Africa, which had seemed so thoroughly pacified, became increasingly difficult to hold as Berber resistance intensified and Arab raids began testing the southern frontiers. And yet, Justinian's legacy endured in ways he could not have foreseen. The code of laws he created would be rediscovered by medieval European scholars and would form the basis for legal systems across the continent. Hagia Sophia still stood, still took the breath away from everyone who entered it, still proclaimed that human beings could create beauty that approached the divine. The monasteries and churches he had built across the empire preserved manuscripts and knowledge through centuries of chaos. His reign became a touchstone, a standard against which later emperors measured themselves, usually finding themselves wanting, but trying nonetheless to recapture some fragment of that impossible dream. The question that haunted Byzantine historians for centuries afterward was simple and unanswerable: had Justinian saved the empire or doomed it? Had his reconquests bought time for Byzantine civilization to flourish, or had they exhausted resources that should have been used to defend the East? Had his legal reforms created a foundation for lasting stability, or had they merely dressed up institutional decay in formal rhetoric? The answer, perhaps, is that he did both. He gave Byzantium a moment of glory that it would remember forever, a proof that greatness was still possible, that the empire could still shake the world. But he also pushed it to the breaking point, committed it to an unsustainable vision of what it should be rather than accepting what it could realistically become. As night settled over Constantinople in those final days of 565, as priests chanted prayers for the emperor's soul and courtiers whispered about what would come next, the city itself remained. The walls still stood. The churches still glowed with candlelight. The ships still crowded the harbor, bringing goods from across the known world. Justinian had dreamed of restoring Rome, and in some ways he had succeeded. He had proven that the empire was not dead, that it could still fight and build and endure. But he had also demonstrated the limits of human will, the way that even the most brilliant and determined ruler cannot bend history to his vision without breaking something essential in the process. The age of Justinian was over, and the empire would have to learn to survive without the terrible energy of his ambition driving it ever forward, ever upward, toward a glory that was always just out of reach. The world that emerged after Justinian's death was darker and more dangerous than anything the empire had faced since its founding. The brief, brilliant flame of reconquest had burned out, leaving behind exhaustion and emptiness. And into that void, enemies poured from every direction, sensing weakness the way wolves sense a wounded deer. The 7th century would test Byzantium in ways that made earlier crises seem almost gentle by comparison. It would be a time of loss and retreat, of territories slipping away like sand through fingers, of survival becoming the only victory that mattered. And yet, somehow, impossibly, the empire endured. From the east came the Persians, and they came not with raiding parties but with armies that aimed to destroy Byzantium entirely. The Sassanid Empire had been Rome's great rival for centuries, trading blows across the Mesopotamian frontier in a conflict so long and ritualized it had almost become routine. But the death of the Emperor Maurice in 602, murdered by a usurper named Phocas, gave the Persian king Khosrow II the excuse he needed to launch total war. Maurice had been his friend, had helped him regain his throne years earlier. Now Maurice was dead, his sons executed, and Khosrow declared that he would avenge this crime even if it meant tearing Byzantium apart stone by stone. The Persian armies rolled westward with a momentum that seemed unstoppable. They took Mesopotamia, then Syria, then something unthinkable happened, they took Jerusalem. The holy city, the place where Christ had walked and died and risen, fell to a Zoroastrian king. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was burned. Tens of thousands of Christians were slaughtered or enslaved. And the Persians carried away the most sacred relic in Christendom, the true cross, the wood on which Jesus had been crucified, discovered by Constantine's mother Helena 3 centuries earlier. For Byzantine Christians, this was more than military defeat, it was theological catastrophe, a sign that God himself had turned his face away from the empire. But the Persians did not stop. They pushed into Egypt, the breadbasket of the empire, and took Alexandria in 619. Byzantine control over the grain supply that fed Constantinople was severed. Famine stalked the capital. And still the Persian advance continued, their armies reaching the shores of the Bosphorus itself, camping within sight of Constantinople's walls. The empire was being dismembered, and there seemed to be nothing anyone could do to stop it. The Emperor Phocas, whose brutality and incompetence had brought this disaster, was finally overthrown in 610 by Heraclius, a general from North Africa who arrived with a fleet and an army just large enough to seize the capital. But Heraclius inherited a dying state, a treasury empty of gold, a population on the edge of starvation, and enemies who smelled final victory. The Avars and Slavs, meanwhile, swept into the Balkans from the north. The Avars were a nomadic people, horse archers who moved like shadows across the plains, striking and vanishing before any response could be organized. The Slavs came in their wake, not as conquerors but as settlers, slowly, persistently occupying lands the empire no longer had the strength to defend. Villages that had been Roman for 600 years suddenly found themselves speaking a new language, worshipping in new ways. The Balkans, the empire's heartland, the territories closest to Constantinople itself, were being ethnically transformed. Roman culture retreated to the coastal cities and a few mountain fortresses, while the interior became Slavic, a change that would prove permanent. In 626, the nightmare reached its climax. The Persians and Avars, coordinating their attacks in an alliance that should have been impossible between such different peoples, launched a combined assault on Constantinople itself. The Persian army camped across the Bosphorus in Chalcedon, visible from the city's walls. The Avar horde, perhaps 80,000 strong, surrounded Constantinople from the land side, bringing with them siege towers and catapults built with Persian expertise. For the first time since its founding, the city of Constantine faced the real possibility of falling. The walls that had never been breached, the fortifications that had protected Byzantium through every crisis, were about to be tested as they had never been tested before. Heraclius was not in the city. He had taken a desperate gamble, leading the Byzantine army deep into Persian territory, hoping to force Khosrow to recall his armies to defend his own heartland. It was brilliant strategy but terrible timing. Constantinople was left defended by skeleton forces, by old men and boys, by priests who took up weapons they barely knew how to hold. The Patriarch Sergius, the spiritual leader of the city, became its de facto military commander, organizing the defense, rallying the people, turning churches into fortresses and sacred vessels into coins to pay the few soldiers who remained. The siege lasted through the summer, and it was a near thing. The Avars launched assault after assault, their siege engines battering the walls while their warriors tried to scale the defenses on ladders that were pushed back with poles and boiling oil. The Byzantine fleet, controlling the waters, prevented the Persians from crossing to join the attack. But it was only a matter of time before the walls were breached, before sheer numbers overwhelmed the defenders. And then, in August, the Avars made their final push. They brought their siege towers right up to the walls, filled in sections of the moat, prepared for the assault that would break the city. And they failed. The reasons why are tangled in history and legend, indistinguishable now after so many centuries. The Byzantines credited the Virgin Mary herself, claiming she appeared on the walls and struck terror into the hearts of the attackers. The more prosaic explanation involves Greek fire, a Byzantine secret weapon, a liquid that burned on water and could not be extinguished, sprayed from bronze tubes mounted on ships. The Byzantine navy destroyed the Avar boats trying to cross the Golden Horn, burning them with fire that turned the water itself into flame. The Avar Khan watched his fleet and his men die screaming, and he broke. The siege lifted. The enemy armies withdrew. Constantinople had survived, but barely, and the memory of how close it had come to falling would haunt the empire forever. Heraclius, meanwhile, was fighting a war that seemed increasingly like madness. Deep in Persian territory, far from Constantinople and the siege he knew was happening but could do nothing to prevent, he led his army through the mountains of Armenia and into the Caucasus. It was winter warfare of the most brutal kind, freezing temperatures, treacherous terrain, supply lines stretched to breaking. His soldiers must have wondered if their emperor had lost his mind, if desperation had driven him to suicide by leading them into the heart of enemy territory with no hope of relief. But Heraclius understood something the Persians had not anticipated. Geography was on his side, paradoxically, because by invading so deeply he had bypassed the fortified frontier, the defensive lines the Persians had built over generations. He was striking at the soft heartland. The gamble paid off. Heraclius defeated Persian armies in a series of running battles, showing a tactical flexibility and personal courage that his soldiers found almost supernatural. He fought in the front ranks, risking death again and again, because he understood that armies follow men they believe are blessed by fortune or God, and sometimes those things are indistinguishable. The Persian response was slow, confused, divided by internal politics and the arrogance of commanders who could not believe a Byzantine army could actually threaten their capital. By the time they organized a coherent defense, Heraclius had already struck at the religious heart of Persia, destroying fire temples and proving that the Zoroastrian faith could not protect its holiest sites. The war turned. Not quickly, not cleanly, but it turned. Khosrow II, who had come so close to destroying Byzantium, found his own empire collapsing from within. His generals, seeing disaster approaching, overthrew him in 628. His son, Kavad II, sued for peace immediately, desperate to salvage something from the catastrophe his father's ambition had created. The terms were almost unbelievable. Persia would return all conquered territories, would withdraw from Egypt and Syria and Mesopotamia, would restore the true cross to Christian hands. After decades of war that had nearly destroyed both empires, the borders would return to where they had been before the whole bloody catastrophe began. Heraclius entered Jerusalem in triumph in 630, carrying the true cross back to the holy city in a ceremony of such emotional power that those who witnessed it wept openly. The emperor walked barefoot through the streets, humble before God who had granted this impossible victory. For a moment, it seemed as if the nightmare was over, as if Byzantium had survived its greatest test and could begin the long process of rebuilding. The Persian threat, which had loomed over the empire for 400 years, seemed broken permanently. Khosrow was dead, executed by his own son. The Sassanid Empire was tearing itself apart in civil war. Surely now, finally, there could be peace. But empires exhausted by war are vulnerable in ways that cannot be seen immediately. Both Byzantium and Persia had bled themselves white fighting each other. Their armies were shadows of what they had been. Their treasuries were empty. Their populations were traumatized and depleted. The provinces that had changed hands multiple times had lost faith in either empire's ability to protect them. And in the Arabian desert, far to the south where neither empire paid much attention, something new was rising, a movement born in the city of Mecca, centered on the teachings of a merchant named Muhammad who claimed to have received revelations from God himself. The Arabs were uniting under the banner of a new faith called Islam, and they were about to change the world. The first Arab raids began in the early 630s, small probing attacks that seemed minor compared to the Great War with Persia. Byzantine commanders barely noticed them, or if they did, they assumed these desert tribesmen would be easily defeated once the empire recovered its strength. But these were not raids for plunder. They were the leading edge of an explosion of religious and military energy unlike anything the Mediterranean world had ever experienced. The Arabs came not as scattered tribes but as a unified force, motivated by faith and the promise of paradise for those who died in jihad. They moved with a speed that seemed impossible, their camel cavalry covering distances in days that would take Byzantine infantry weeks. Syria fell first. The great cities that had been Byzantine strongholds for centuries, Damascus, Antioch, Jerusalem again, submitted to Arab rule almost without resistance. The populations, exhausted by endless war, saw no reason to fight for an empire that had failed to protect them. Many of the local Christians were Monophysites, adherents of a doctrine that Byzantine orthodoxy had declared heretical, and they had been persecuted by Constantinople for generations. To them, Arab rule seemed preferable to Byzantine oppression. At the Battle of Yarmouk in 636, a Byzantine army attempting to retake Syria was annihilated. 25,000 soldiers died, and with them died any hope of stopping the Arab advance. Egypt followed. Alexandria, the great city of learning and commerce, held out for years but ultimately surrendered in 642. The loss was catastrophic. Egypt had fed Constantinople for centuries. Its grain shipments had sustained the capital through siege and famine. Now that lifeline was severed, and the empire faced the prospect of chronic food shortages. Worse, the loss was symbolic. Egypt had been Roman longer than almost any other province. To lose it felt like losing a limb, a fundamental part of what made the empire whole. Persia, meanwhile, collapsed entirely. The Arabs swept through Mesopotamia and into the Iranian heartland with a momentum that seemed divinely ordained. The Sassanid kings fled deeper and deeper into the east, until the last of them was murdered in 651 by one of his own courtiers. An empire that had stood for 400 years, that had nearly destroyed Byzantium, vanished in less than 2 decades. The Arabs now controlled everything from the borders of India to the shores of the Mediterranean. They had built, in a single generation, an empire larger than Rome at its height. And they showed no signs of stopping. Byzantium, by the middle of the 7th century, had been reduced to a fraction of its former size. The great arc of territories around the Mediterranean was gone. The empire now consisted of Anatolia, parts of the Balkans, scattered holdings in Italy, and a few islands. Constantinople still stood, still controlled the straits, but it ruled over an empire that looked nothing like the realm Justinian had known. The loss was not just territorial. It was psychological. For 600 years, since Constantine had founded his city, Byzantium had maintained the fiction that it was Rome, that the empire was eternal and universal, that temporary setbacks could always be reversed. Now that fiction was impossible to maintain. This was not temporary. This was permanent loss, a new world order in which Byzantium was no longer the great power but merely one kingdom among many, fighting for survival. The emperors who followed Heraclius struggled with challenges that would have broken lesser men. Constans II watched Arab fleets appear in the Mediterranean, challenging Byzantine naval supremacy that had gone uncontested for centuries. He moved the capital briefly to Syracuse in Sicily, as if distance from Constantinople might somehow make the problems less overwhelming. He was murdered by his own soldiers in a bathhouse, beaten to death with a soap dish in a scene that captured the absurd brutality into which imperial politics had descended. His successor, Constantine IV, faced Arab siege of Constantinople itself in the 670s, not a single assault but a grinding, years-long blockade that aimed to starve the city into submission. The Arab siege of Constantinople was different from the Avar assault decades earlier. This was not a wild rush at the walls, a storm that might break quickly one way or another. This was patient, methodical, the kind of siege that knew it had time on its side. Each spring, the Arab fleet would arrive, hundreds of ships carrying soldiers and supplies, and they would establish bases on islands near the city, cutting off trade routes and slowly tightening the noose. Each winter, they would withdraw, but only partially, leaving garrisons behind to ensure the Byzantines could never fully recover. It was psychological warfare as much as military strategy, designed to break the spirit of a people who had already endured too much. But the Arabs had not counted on Greek fire. The exact composition of this weapon remains a mystery even now, lost when Byzantium finally fell, but its effects were terrifying and decisive. A liquid that ignited on contact with water, that burned so hot it could melt armor, that could not be extinguished by any means the Arabs possessed. Byzantine dromons, sleek, fast warships, mounted bronze siphons at their prows that sprayed this liquid fire onto enemy vessels. The Arab fleet, crowded in the narrow waters near Constantinople, found itself trapped and burning. Ships that tried to escape carried the fire with them, spreading panic through the entire formation. The screams of men burning alive in water that had turned into hell itself echoed across the Bosphorus for hours. The siege broke in 678, not with a climactic battle but with a gradual, grinding realization that Constantinople could not be taken, that the walls and the fire and the desperate courage of its defenders made the city impregnable. The Arab fleet withdrew, and on the return journey, storms destroyed what Greek fire had not. Of the fleet that had departed confident of victory, only a fraction returned home. The Byzantine victory at Constantinople was as significant as any battle in history, though it is less remembered than it deserves. If the city had fallen, all of Europe would have been open to Arab conquest. Christianity might have remained a minority faith confined to the fringes of the continent. The entire trajectory of Western civilization would have shifted. But Constantinople held, and in holding, it saved more than just itself. Yet survival came at a cost that went beyond the bodies burned or the gold spent. The empire that emerged from these wars was fundamentally transformed, stripped down to essentials, militarized in ways that would have been unrecognizable to earlier generations. The old provincial system, inherited from Rome, gave way to the theme system, military districts governed by generals who combined civil and military authority. Soldiers were granted land in exchange for military service, creating a class of farmer warriors who had personal stakes in defending their territories. It was efficient, flexible, capable of rapid mobilization. But it was also feudal in all but name, a fracturing of central authority that would create problems for future emperors. The cities shrank. The great urban centers that had characterized the early empire, places where tens of thousands lived in relative comfort, sustained by complex trade networks and imperial subsidies, could no longer be maintained. People retreated to smaller settlements, to fortified towns on hilltops, to places that could be defended with limited resources. The classical civilization that had prized urbanism and sophistication gave way to something more rural, more militarized, more focused on bare survival than cultural flourishing. Libraries were lost, not to dramatic burnings but to simple neglect, to the gradual understanding that in a world of constant warfare, there were more pressing needs than preserving ancient texts. The population of Constantinople itself, which may have reached 500,000 in Justinian's day, probably fell to less than 100,000 by the end of the 7th century. Entire neighborhoods stood empty, their buildings quarried for stone to repair the walls. The great forums grew silent. The hippodrome still hosted races, but the crowds were smaller, their enthusiasm muted by hunger and exhaustion. The city survived, but it survived as a fortress more than a metropolis, its purpose reduced to the essential function of not falling. And yet, through all this loss and transformation, something endured that was perhaps more important than territory or population. The idea of Byzantium persisted. The conviction that this empire was chosen by God, that its purpose was to preserve Christian civilization against the chaos that surrounded it, that its survival mattered not just politically but cosmically, this belief held even when almost everything else had been stripped away. The emperors still wore the purple. The patriarch still celebrated the liturgy in Hagia Sophia. The administration still functioned, maintaining records and collecting taxes and sending out orders in the name of an authority that claimed to be universal even when its reach had become tragically limited. The monasteries, paradoxically, flourished during this age of crisis. As the cities emptied, holy men and women retreated to remote places, caves in Cappadocia, rocky islands in the Aegean, mountaintops where the world below seemed very far away. They built communities dedicated to prayer and copying manuscripts, preserving knowledge not because anyone had ordered them to but because they believed it was holy work. These monks would become some of Byzantium's greatest heroes, not through military valor but through patient, anonymous labor that saved texts and traditions that would have otherwise vanished completely. The iconoclast controversy, which would convulse the empire in the 8th and 9th centuries, had its roots in these desperate times. Icons, Painted images of Christ and the saints had become central to Byzantine worship, objects of veneration that some believers treated as almost miraculous. But as defeat followed defeat, as the empire shrank and the Arabs seemed unstoppable, some began to wonder if God was punishing Byzantium for idolatry. The Arabs and Jews, after all, rejected images in their worship, and they were winning. Perhaps, some emperors reasoned, Byzantium needed to purify its faith, to destroy the icons that had led the empire into sin. The resulting controversy would tear Byzantine society apart, pitting emperor against patriarch, soldier against monk, icon venerators against icon smashers in a conflict that was about more than theology. It was about identity, about what it meant to be Byzantine when so much else had been lost. But that struggle still lay in the future. For now, at the end of the 7th century, as the new century approached like a traveler whose face could not yet be seen, Byzantium had survived. Barely. Bloodied and reduced and transformed almost beyond recognition, but survived. The Arab advance had been stopped at Constantinople's walls. The losses in territory were permanent, but the core remained intact. Anatolia, the Balkans, the capital itself, these would be enough. They would have to be enough. The age of expansion, of dreams of reconquering the West or restoring Rome's glory, was over. The age of survival had begun, and it would last for centuries. The night that had fallen over the empire was deep and cold. But somewhere in that darkness, a light still burned. It flickered, certainly. It wavered when storms came. But it did not go out. And the people who tended that light, who fed it with their labor and their faith and their refusal to accept extinction, believed with a certainty that nothing could shake that morning would come eventually. That Byzantium would endure not because it was the strongest or the richest or the most favored, but simply because it refused to die. Because survival itself, the stubborn insistence on continuing to exist against all odds and all enemies, had become the empire's greatest virtue and its defining purpose. They were the last of the Romans, and they would remain so for as long as walls could be defended and prayers could be spoken and a single soul still remembered what Constantinople had been and might, God willing, someday be again. There are wounds that never truly heal, breaks that cannot be mended no matter how much time passes or how earnestly people try to forget. The year 1054 marked such a break, a fracture so deep and final that it would echo through centuries, shaping wars and cultures and identities in ways the men who caused it could never have imagined. On a hot July day in Constantinople, a papal legate named Humbert strode into Hagia Sophia during the afternoon liturgy and placed a bull of excommunication on the altar. The document declared the Patriarch of Constantinople and all who followed him to be heretics, cut off from the true church, damned unless they repented. Then Humbert walked out, shaking the dust from his feet in the ancient gesture of rejection, leaving behind a city stunned into silence and a church that would never be whole again. The split had been centuries in the making, building like pressure behind a dam that everyone knew must eventually break but that no one quite knew how to prevent. East and West had been drifting apart since the empire itself had divided, since Latin and Greek had stopped being languages that educated people spoke interchangeably and had become markers of separate cultural worlds. Rome, in the West, had survived the barbarian invasions by becoming something new, a spiritual authority that transcended politics, a papacy that claimed jurisdiction over all Christians regardless of what king or emperor ruled their lands. The popes had made alliances with Frankish kings and Germanic emperors, had crowned Charlemagne as a rival Roman emperor in the year 800, had built a power structure that was independent of Constantinople and increasingly indifferent to what the Byzantine emperors wanted or believed. Constantinople, meanwhile, had maintained the older model where church and state were intertwined, inseparable, two aspects of a single Christian empire. The emperor was not just a political leader but God's chosen representative on earth, responsible for defending orthodoxy and calling councils and settling theological disputes. The patriarch was powerful, certainly, honored and respected, but he served at the emperor's pleasure and could be appointed or removed as political necessity required. This Caesaropapism, as it would later be called, seemed natural and right to Byzantines. It was how Constantine had structured the church, how it had always been. But to Rome, it looked like tyranny, like secular power trampling on spiritual authority that should answer only to God. The theological differences were real but probably not insurmountable if anyone had truly wanted to bridge them. The filioque controversy, whether the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father alone or from the Father and the Son, was the kind of subtle doctrinal distinction that could occupy theologians for lifetimes without necessarily dividing ordinary believers. The West had added the phrase, "and the Son," to the Nicene Creed, and the East objected that this changed foundational doctrine without the consent of an ecumenical council. It mattered, certainly, but people had disagreed about such things before without the Church splitting in two. The real issues were deeper, more about culture and power and the slow accumulation of resentments than about any single point of theology. Language itself had become a barrier. By the 11th century, educated Romans no longer read Greek with any facility, and educated Byzantines had lost their Latin. The common intellectual culture that had once united the Mediterranean world had fractured into two separate traditions that could barely communicate. When Eastern and Western theologians met, they literally could not understand each other, and the translators between them often lacked the theological sophistication to convey subtle arguments accurately. Misunderstandings multiplied. Each side heard the other's positions in simplified, distorted forms and concluded that their counterparts were either fools or heretics. The patience required for genuine dialogue, the humility to admit that perhaps one's own position was not perfectly clear or that the other side might have valid points, these virtues became increasingly rare as the decades passed. The rise of the Normans in southern Italy brought matters to a crisis. These fierce warriors, descendants of Vikings who had settled in France and then pushed south seeking land and glory, conquered Byzantine territories in Italy and imposed Latin Christianity on populations that had been following Greek rites for centuries. Churches were seized and rededicated. Greek priests were expelled or forced to accept papal authority. The Byzantines watched helplessly as their last holdings in Italy, territories that had been Roman for over 1,000 years, were not just conquered but culturally erased, transformed from east to west by Norman swords and papal blessing. The humiliation burned, and with it burned the last remnants of goodwill between Rome and Constantinople. The immediate cause of the 1054 crisis was almost absurdly petty, a dispute about what kind of bread should be used in the Eucharist. The West used unleavened bread, azymes, following what they believed was the Jewish Passover tradition that Christ would have used at the Last Supper. The East used leavened bread, arguing that the resurrection had introduced something new into the world and that the bread should reflect that transformation. It was the kind of issue that should have been resolved through patient discussion or, failing that, agreed to as a matter of legitimate local custom. Instead, it became a weapon. Each side accused the other of heresy, of corrupting the sacred mysteries, of leading the faithful into damnation over something as simple as yeast. The papal legate Humbert was perhaps the worst possible choice to negotiate this crisis. He was brilliant, learned, absolutely convinced of papal supremacy, and entirely lacking in diplomatic grace or cultural sensitivity. He arrived in Constantinople in 1054 with a mission to assert Rome's authority, to make clear that the Pope was the final arbiter of all disputes, that Constantinople and its patriarch were subordinate whether they wished to acknowledge it or not. The Patriarch Michael Cerularius was equally stubborn, equally proud, equally convinced that his position was the orthodox one inherited from the apostles and that Rome had fallen into error and arrogance. When these two men met, it was not a negotiation but a collision. The meetings between Humbert and Cerularius were disasters from the start. They spoke past each other, each hearing in the other's words only confirmation of suspicions they had arrived with. Humbert insisted that the Pope, as successor to Peter, held authority over all churches everywhere, that this was not a matter for debate but a fundamental truth of Christian order. Cerularius responded that the Pentarchy, the 5 great patriarchs of Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, were equals, that no single bishop could claim supremacy over the others, that this had been the understanding of the early church councils. Neither man was entirely wrong in their historical claims, but neither was willing to admit that the other's position had any validity whatsoever. The Byzantine Emperor, Constantine IX, watched the escalating conflict with growing alarm. He needed papal support against the Normans who were devouring his Italian territories. He wanted reconciliation, or at least a diplomatic truce that would allow him to focus on military rather than theological crises. But Cerularius would not bend, and the Patriarch had the people of Constantinople behind him. Anti-Latin sentiment had been building for years, resentment over Norman conquests, anger at Western arrogance, suspicion that Rome had abandoned true Christianity in its accommodation with barbarian kingdoms. When Humbert accused the Greeks of removing the filioque from the creed, a particularly galling charge since the East had never added it in the first place, popular fury erupted in the streets. Humbert's excommunication, delivered during the liturgy in Hagia Sophia, was as much theater as theology. He meant to shock, to demonstrate Rome's power, to make clear that defiance of papal authority carried consequences. The bull he placed on the altar was written in Latin, which most of those present could not read, but its meaning was clear enough. It declared Cerularius and his followers to be worse than pagans and Jews, accused them of heresy on a dozen different points, and called down God's judgment upon them. The document was inflammatory, excessive, probably unauthorized. The Pope who had sent Humbert to Constantinople had died months earlier, meaning Humbert technically had no authority to excommunicate anyone. But none of that mattered in the moment. What mattered was the gesture, the public humiliation, the undeniable statement that Rome considered Constantinople to be in the wrong. Cerularius responded with his own excommunication, declaring the papal legates to be heretics and anathema. He summoned a council that formally condemned the filioque and other Western practices as innovations that violated apostolic tradition. Crowds gathered outside the patriarchal palace, chanting support for Cerularius and denouncing the Latins. Books were written, sermons preached, each side compiling lists of the other's errors and heresies. The rhetoric grew increasingly bitter. What had begun as a theological dispute transformed into mutual demonization. The West saw the East as schismatic, stubborn, infected with Greek pride and subtle heresies. The East saw the West as heretical, barbaric, corrupted by Germanic influences and papal ambition. The tragedy was that most ordinary Christians, East and West, probably had no idea that anything definitive had happened. The year 1054 did not feel like a world historical moment to people living through it. There had been controversies before. Popes and patriarchs had excommunicated each other in the past and later reconciled. Surely this too would pass, surely wiser heads would prevail, surely the church that had survived so many crises could survive this one as well. But slowly, gradually, it became clear that something had changed. Communion between Rome and Constantinople was broken. Eastern bishops who visited Rome were required to accept papal supremacy. Western bishops who visited Constantinople were required to reject the filioque. The middle ground disappeared. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 would make the split permanent and unforgivable. Western crusaders, diverted from their stated goal of liberating Jerusalem, instead attacked Constantinople itself. They breached the walls, sacked the city with a brutality that shocked even medieval sensibilities, murdered and raped and looted for 3 days while Hagia Sophia was desecrated and its treasures hauled away. The altar Humbert had placed his excommunication upon was hacked apart for the silver beneath its covering. Icons were smashed. Relics were stolen. A prostitute was placed on the Patriarch's throne while drunken crusaders sang obscene songs. The Byzantines, who had endured Arab sieges and barbarian invasions, who had survived plagues and famines, were conquered and humiliated by Christians from the West who claimed to be fighting in Christ's name. The Latin Empire established in Constantinople lasted only 57 years, but the hatred it generated would last forever. Even after Byzantine forces recaptured the city in 1261, even after attempts at reunion were made by emperors desperate for Western military aid against the Turks, the people would not forget. When the last Byzantine emperor tried to impose church union in 1439, accepting papal supremacy in exchange for a crusade that never came, the Byzantine people rejected it utterly. Better, they said, to fall to the Turks than to submit to Rome. Better the Sultan's turban than the cardinal's hat. The bitterness ran that deep. The schism isolated Byzantium in ways that were both spiritual and practical. The West, united under papal authority, could mobilize crusades and organize resistance to Islamic expansion. The East, increasingly alone, found itself without allies when the Ottoman threat became existential. Appeals to the West for help were met with demands for submission to Rome, for acceptance of doctrines the Byzantines believed were heretical, for the surrender of an identity that had defined them for 1,000 years. The price of alliance was too high, and so Byzantium faced its enemies alone, abandoned by Christians who should have been brothers but who had become, through centuries of division and resentment, almost as foreign as the Muslims themselves. The Orthodox Church that survived the schism developed its own distinct character, shaped by isolation and persecution. It became more mystical, more focused on the contemplative traditions of the Desert Fathers, more suspicious of Western rationalism and scholastic theology. The liturgy grew even more elaborate, the iconography more stylized, the spirituality more otherworldly. Orthodoxy defined itself in opposition to Rome, preserving traditions that might otherwise have evolved, holding fast to practices and doctrines precisely because the West had abandoned them. The split created not just two churches but two different ways of being Christian, two different spiritual aesthetics that would shape the religious culture of Eastern and Western Europe in profoundly different ways. The monks of Mount Athos, that rocky peninsula jutting into the Aegean where women were forbidden to set foot and where time seemed to move more slowly than in the world beyond, became the keepers of Orthodox purity in the centuries after the schism. Monasteries clung to cliffsides there, their walls rising from stone as if they had grown naturally from the mountain itself. In the churches carved into rock and decorated with frescoes that glowed in candlelight, monks chanted the ancient liturgies exactly as they had been chanted for centuries, preserving every word, every gesture, every moment of silence. To visit Athos was to step out of the 11th or 12th or 13th century and into something older, something that claimed direct continuity with the apostles themselves. These monks saw themselves as defenders of a faith under siege. The schism with Rome was not, to them, a political failure or a tragic misunderstanding. It was spiritual warfare, a battle for the soul of Christianity itself. They compiled lists of Western errors, wrote treatises explaining why the Filioque was heresy, why papal supremacy violated the conciliar tradition of the early Church, why unleavened bread corrupted the Eucharist. Their writings were not meant to persuade Western Christians that ship had sailed, but to steel Eastern believers against the temptation to compromise, to remind them that truth mattered more than unity, that it was better to stand alone and orthodox than to embrace a false reconciliation that would corrupt the faith. Yet there were always those who tried to bridge the divide, who believed that the schism was a wound in the body of Christ that demanded healing no matter how difficult that healing might be. Emperors, facing military disasters and desperate for Western aid, repeatedly attempted church unions. The Council of Lyon in 1274 produced a formal reconciliation, with the Byzantine Emperor accepting papal primacy in exchange for promises of military support against the fragmenting empire's enemies. But the union existed only on paper. The Byzantine clergy rejected it almost unanimously. The people rioted in the streets when news arrived that their emperor had surrendered to Rome. The promised military aid never materialized, and the union collapsed almost as soon as it was declared. The same pattern repeated at the Council of Florence in 1439, the last serious attempt at reconciliation before Constantinople fell. The Emperor John VIII brought a delegation of bishops and theologians to Italy, where they debated with Western churchmen for months. The discussions were learned, sometimes genuinely respectful, touching on all the old controversies with a sophistication that had been missing in 1054. In the end, a formula was found that both sides could accept, at least in theory. The Greeks agreed that the Filioque was acceptable if properly understood, and the Latins agreed that the Pope was first among equals rather than an absolute monarch over the Church. It was compromise, the kind of carefully worded agreement that diplomats love and that means different things to different readers. But when the Byzantine delegation returned home, they found a population that felt betrayed. The Patriarch of Constantinople had not attended the council, sending representatives but withholding his own endorsement. When those representatives returned preaching union, he and most of the other Eastern patriarchs rejected it immediately. The people of Constantinople gathered in churches to denounce the traitors who had sold their faith for empty promises of Western aid. The Grand Duke Notaras, one of the empire's most powerful men, reportedly declared that he would rather see the Turkish turban in Constantinople than the Latin mitre, better to surrender to Muslims who at least made no claims to religious authority over orthodoxy than to submit to heretics who claimed to be the true church. This sentiment, which seems shocking and self-destructive to modern readers, made a certain terrible sense in the Byzantine worldview. The empire had been reduced to almost nothing, just the city of Constantinople and a few scattered territories, surrounded on all sides by the Ottomans who were clearly gathering for a final assault. Military survival seemed impossible. But spiritual survival, the preservation of true orthodoxy, that was still achievable. If the price of Western military aid was the surrender of Orthodox identity, then that price was too high. Better to fall with faith intact than to survive as something unrecognizable. Better martyrdom than apostasy. The schism had done this, had created a situation where Christians would rather die than reunite with other Christians, where the divisions within Christianity had become more important than the threats from without. It was a tragedy born of pride and misunderstanding and the accumulation of centuries of resentment. Neither side was entirely wrong in their doctrinal positions, and neither was entirely right. The Filioque controversy involved real theological questions about the nature of the Trinity that could not be simply dismissed. The question of papal authority touched on fundamental issues about how the Church should be governed. These were not trivial matters. But neither were they worth the price that was paid. The schism weakened Christianity at precisely the moment when unity was most needed. It divided resources, created enemies where there should have been allies, turned theological disputes into civilizational conflicts. The Crusades, which might have been a unified Christian response to Islamic expansion, became instead a series of increasingly cynical military adventures that enriched Western nobles while leaving Eastern Christians vulnerable and resentful. The fall of Constantinople, which might have been prevented by a coordinated Christian defense, became inevitable partly because the Christians could not coordinate, could not trust each other, could not see past their own divisions to the larger threat they all faced. And yet, paradoxically, the schism also preserved something valuable. Orthodoxy, isolated and embattled, maintained traditions and spiritual practices that might have been lost in a more unified church. The mystical theology of the hesychasts, the intricate beauty of Byzantine iconography, the haunting depth of Orthodox chant, these flourished in the Orthodox world partly because they were protected from Western rationalism and reform. When Protestant reformers in the 16th century attacked images and elaborate liturgy, when Catholic counter-reformers imposed rigid uniformity, the Orthodox Church remained largely untouched, preserving an older form of Christianity that connected believers to the ancient world in ways that both Catholicism and Protestantism had lost. The schism created two Christianities, each convinced it was the true heir of the apostles, each preserving different aspects of the early church, each blind to the value of what the other had maintained. The West kept Roman law and administrative skill, scholastic theology, and missionary energy. The East kept contemplative spirituality and liturgical richness, conciliar governance and mystical theology. If they had remained united, would Christianity have been stronger or merely more uniform? Would the tensions that led to the Reformation have been resolved earlier, or would a unified church have shattered even more catastrophically? These questions cannot be answered, but they haunt anyone who studies the schism seriously. In the centuries after 1054, Orthodox Christians lived with a sense of being the faithful remnant, the ones who had not compromised, who had preserved the deposit of faith intact while others innovated and strayed. This gave them strength to endure Ottoman rule, communist persecution, all the trials that would come. But it also gave them a defensiveness, a tendency to see any change as betrayal, that made orthodoxy sometimes rigid when flexibility was needed. The wound of the schism never healed, and the scar tissue that formed around it shaped Orthodox identity in ways both beautiful and tragic. And in the quiet of Orthodox churches, in monasteries on Mount Athos and in villages throughout Eastern Europe, the liturgy continued, unchanged and unchanging, a river of prayer that flowed from the apostolic age through Constantinople's glory and fall, through centuries of division and suffering, carrying forward the faith as the East understood it. Right or wrong, pure or proud, the Orthodox Church survived the schism and everything that followed. It became the keeper of a memory, a witness to the conviction that truth matters more than unity, that some compromises cannot be made, that there are things worth losing empires for. Whether that conviction was wisdom or folly, faith or stubbornness, each person who encounters this history must decide for themselves. But it was, undeniably, Byzantine, a mixture of holiness and pride, of spiritual depth and political calculation, of martyrdom and survival that defined an empire that called itself Roman but was truly its own strange, magnificent, tragic thing. By the time the 15th century arrived, Byzantium was no longer an empire in any meaningful sense. It was a memory that still breathed, a ghost that had somehow learned to walk among the living. The territories that had once stretched across 3 continents had shrunk to almost nothing, the city of Constantinople itself, the Peloponnese in southern Greece, a few islands scattered across the Aegean like stones skipped across water. The population of the capital, which had once approached 1 million souls, had dwindled to perhaps 50,000, maybe fewer. Entire neighborhoods stood empty, their buildings slowly collapsing as nature reclaimed streets that had bustled with life for 1,000 years. Farms and vineyards grew inside the ancient walls, places where once there had been forums and bathhouses and the noise of human ambition. And yet the city endured, impossibly, stubbornly, as if by refusing to acknowledge its own irrelevance it could somehow remain significant. The emperor still lived in the palace, though much of it was closed off now, too expensive to maintain, too vast for a court that had shrunk to a handful of officials and ceremonial positions that had lost their purpose. The patriarch still celebrated the liturgy in Hagia Sophia, though the great church was showing its age, cracks in the dome that no one had the resources to properly repair, mosaics fading as gold leaf flaked away and no craftsman remained who knew the ancient techniques to restore them. The Senate still met, though it governed nothing beyond the city walls and made decisions that no one beyond those walls cared about. It was all theater now, a performance of empire for an audience that had long since departed. The Ottoman Empire surrounded Constantinople like a sea around a single rock. Sultan Mehmed II, who would come to be called Mehmed the Conqueror, looked at the Byzantine remnant with a mixture of frustration and fascination. His ancestors had tried twice before to take Constantinople and had failed both times. The walls that Theodosius had built 1,000 years earlier still stood, still defied every siege engine and tactic that had been thrown against them. But Mehmed was different from his predecessors. He was young, brilliant, absolutely convinced of his own destiny. He had been educated by the best scholars, Muslim and Christian alike. He could discuss Greek philosophy and Persian poetry with equal facility. And he wanted Constantinople with a desire that went beyond strategic calculation. He wanted it because it was there, because it represented a challenge that no conqueror had overcome, because taking it would make him immortal in the memory of history. The Byzantines knew what was coming. Everyone knew. Mehmed made no secret of his intentions. He built fortresses on both sides of the Bosphorus, cutting off the city's access to the Black Sea. He assembled an army larger than any Byzantine emperor had commanded in centuries, perhaps 80,000 soldiers, perhaps more, drawn from across the Ottoman domains. And he brought something new, something that would change warfare forever, massive bronze cannons, the largest ever cast, capable of hurling stone balls weighing half a ton against fortifications that had been designed in an age when such weapons were unimaginable. The Byzantine Emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, faced the approaching storm with a courage born of resignation. He was not born to the purple, not the eldest son raised with the expectation of rule. He had become emperor almost by default, the last surviving member of the Palaiologos dynasty still capable of wearing the crown. He was 48 years old in 1453, weathered by years of defending an empire that everyone knew was doomed. He had no illusions about what was coming. He sent envoys to the west, pleading for aid, offering church union one final time if only someone would send ships and soldiers. But the west had heard these pleas before and had grown tired of them. A few hundred Italian mercenaries arrived, adventurers seeking glory or gold or both. The Genoese merchant community in the Galata district across the Golden Horn promised neutrality, which was another way of saying they would not help. No crusade was coming. No miracle would save the city as it had been saved before. Constantine gathered his people and told them the truth. The siege was coming, and they would have to face it alone. Every able-bodied man would be needed on the walls. The women and children would help carry stones and boiling water, tend the wounded, pray for deliverance that might not come. The churches were stripped of their remaining treasures, melted down to pay soldiers and buy supplies. Icons that had been venerated for centuries were carried to the walls, propped against the stones as if their painted eyes could turn back the Ottoman tide. It was both practical and desperate, sacred and secular mixed together in the way that Byzantium had always mixed them. The siege began in early April 1453, and from the start it was clear that this time would be different. The Ottoman cannons were monstrous, ungainly things that took hours to load and cool after each firing, but when they spoke their voice was thunder. The stone balls smashed against the Theodosian walls with an impact that could be felt throughout the city. Cracks appeared in stonework that had stood for a millennium. The defenders worked frantically at night to repair the damage, filling in breaches with timber and rubble and whatever else they could find, knowing that each day brought the walls closer to catastrophic failure. Mehmed tried everything. His armies assaulted the walls repeatedly, wave after wave of soldiers climbing ladders while Byzantine defenders pushed them back with poles and threw down rocks and Greek fire that still burned, still terrified, even in this final hour. The Ottomans tried to tunnel under the walls, and Byzantine engineers counter-tunneled to stop them, fighting vicious battles underground in darkness lit only by torches. The Ottoman fleet tried to force its way into the Golden Horn, only to find their path blocked by a massive chain stretched across the harbor mouth, an ancient defense that still worked after all these centuries. So Mehmed did something unprecedented. He built a road of greased logs over the hills of Galata and dragged 70 ships overland, bypassing the chain entirely, launching them into the Golden Horn behind the Byzantine defenses. The people of Constantinople woke one morning to find Ottoman ships sailing in waters that should have been safe, impossibly, as if the laws of nature themselves had been suspended. It was brilliant and terrifying, a demonstration that this sultan would not be stopped by conventional defenses, that he would break the rules if the rules stood in his way. The siege dragged on through April and into May, and with each passing day the city's desperation deepened. Food was running short. Wells were contaminated. Disease spread through the crowded quarters where families huddled together seeking safety. The walls that had protected Constantinople for so long were crumbling under the relentless bombardment. The great cannon that Mehmed had commissioned, the one that required 60 oxen and hundreds of men to move into position, fired perhaps 7 times a day, but each shot dealt damage that could not be fully repaired before the next one came. The Byzantines patched and improvised, stretching resources that had already been stretched too thin, defending miles of walls with thousands of men when they needed tens of thousands. Constantine XI fought alongside his soldiers, refusing the safety of the palace, sleeping in his armor when he slept at all. He walked the walls each night, speaking with the defenders, sharing their meager rations, making sure they knew their emperor stood with them. It was all he could offer, solidarity in suffering, the knowledge that they would face the end together. The ancient ceremonies of imperial majesty had given way to something simpler and more profound. Here was a king who would die with his people, who would not flee or surrender or try to save himself at their expense. It was the last, purest expression of what Byzantine emperors had always claimed to be, God's chosen representative on earth, responsible for his flock even unto death. Inside Hagia Sophia, the services continued with a fervor intensified by approaching doom. Catholics and Orthodox prayed together, their ancient divisions forgotten or at least set aside in the face of extinction. The last liturgy celebrated in a free Constantinople took place on the evening of May 28, 1453. The great church was packed with people, so crowded that many had to stand outside in the courtyard. They sang the ancient hymns, chanted the responses they had learned as children, took communion perhaps for the last time from hands that trembled with exhaustion and fear. Constantine himself was there, receiving the Eucharist, asking forgiveness from anyone he had wronged, embracing soldiers and priests and ordinary citizens as equals before God. When the service ended, he did not return to the palace but went directly to the walls, taking his position for the final assault that everyone knew was coming. Mehmed had set the date, May 29. He gave his soldiers a final exhortation, promising them 3 days of unrestricted plundering if they took the city, reminding them that Constantinople's wealth was legendary even in its diminished state. More importantly, he reminded them of glory, that they would be the ones to accomplish what so many before them had attempted and failed, that their names would be remembered forever as the conquerors of the city that could not be conquered. The Ottoman army spent the night in celebration and prayer, bonfires lighting the darkness, the sound of drums and war cries echoing across the walls to where the Byzantine defenders stood silent, conserving their strength for what dawn would bring. The assault began before sunrise, while darkness still held and the defenders' eyes were tired from a long night of watching. It came in waves, each one more desperate than the last. First the irregular troops, the Bashi-bazouks who fought for plunder rather than pay, expendable men thrown against the walls to exhaust the defenders and test for weaknesses. They died by the hundreds, but they served their purpose. The Byzantines used up arrows and stones and energy repelling them. Then came the regular infantry, disciplined and determined, with proper scaling ladders and siege towers. They died too, but they died more slowly, making progress, forcing the defenders to fight harder for every foot of wall. And then came the Janissaries, the elite troops who had never known defeat, trained from childhood to be the perfect warriors, fanatically loyal to the Sultan. They attacked in the pre-dawn darkness with a discipline that was terrifying in its precision. No shouting, no wasted motion, just the steady advance of men who knew their craft and trusted in their strength. They found a small gate, the Kirkaporta, that had been left unlocked, whether by accident or treachery, no one would ever know for certain. A handful of Janissaries got through, climbed to the top of the walls, and raised the Ottoman banner. It was a small breach, easily contained under normal circumstances, but these were not normal circumstances. The defenders were exhausted, depleted, at the breaking point. At that moment, the Genoese commander Giovanni Justiniani, who had been the heart of the defense, the one man whose tactical brilliance and courage had kept the walls intact for 7 weeks, was struck by a projectile that pierced his armor. The wound was serious, perhaps mortal. He asked to be taken to his ship, to die there rather than on the walls. Constantine begged him to stay, knowing that his departure would break the defender's spirit, but Justiniani could not continue. As he was carried away, the soldiers who had followed him wavered. Some retreated. Others held their ground, but the cohesion was breaking. Constantine saw it happening. Saw the Ottomans pouring through the Kirkaporta, saw his line fragmenting, saw the end arriving not as a dramatic final stand but as a slow collapse born of exhaustion and the simple mathematics of too few men defending too much wall against too many enemies. He could have fled. Ships were still in the harbor. He could have escaped to the Peloponnese, set up a government in exile, continued some shadow of resistance. But that was not who Constantine XI was. He was the last Roman emperor, and he would die as a Roman emperor should. He tore off his imperial regalia, the purple that marked him as emperor, because he did not want to die as a symbol but as a soldier among soldiers. Accounts of his final moments are contradictory and probably mythologized, but they agree on the essentials. He gathered the few men still around him and charged into the Ottoman soldiers flooding through the gate. He fought with a sword in his hand, pushing forward into the mass of enemies, and then he disappeared. His body was never positively identified. Some claim they found him later, recognized only by his purple boots. Others said he died anonymously, just another corpse among thousands, his final resting place unknown. Perhaps that was fitting. The last emperor of Rome died not as a god-king on a throne but as a man in the dust and blood, indistinguishable from any other soldier who had given his life defending what he loved. The city fell into a nightmare that would scar the memory of everyone who survived it. Mehmed had promised his soldiers 3 days of plunder, and he kept his word. They poured through the breached walls like a flood, seeking gold and slaves and revenge for the casualties they had suffered. Churches were ransacked, their treasures hauled away, their sacred vessels melted down for the metal. Libraries accumulated over centuries were scattered or burned, manuscripts that represented unique copies of ancient texts lost forever in hours of mindless destruction. Homes were broken into, their inhabitants killed or enslaved depending on age and usefulness. Women and children were dragged away in chains, destined for slave markets across the Ottoman Empire. In Hagia Sophia, people had gathered seeking sanctuary, believing that God would protect them in his house, or at least that the Ottomans would respect sacred space. They were wrong. Ottoman soldiers broke down the doors and found thousands huddled inside, praying desperately, singing hymns even as the enemy approached. The soldiers separated the young and attractive for the slave markets and killed many of the rest. The great church that had been the heart of Orthodox Christianity for almost 1,000 years was desecrated, its altar smashed, its mosaics defaced, the blood of the faithful staining floors where emperors had been crowned and ecumenical councils had debated the nature of God. Mehmed entered the city in triumph on the afternoon of May 29, riding through streets still littered with bodies, past buildings still smoldering. He went directly to Hagia Sophia and dismounted at its entrance, picking up a handful of dirt and pouring it over his head in a gesture of humility before God. Then he entered the church and declared that it would become a mosque. Workmen immediately began covering the Christian mosaics with plaster, installing a mihrab to indicate the direction of Mecca, building minarets at the corners. The transformation was swift and thorough. Within days, the building that had defined Byzantine Christianity was calling Muslims to prayer, and the sound that echoed through Constantinople was no longer church bells but the adhan, the Islamic call to worship. The death toll from the siege and its aftermath is impossible to know with certainty. Thousands died in the fighting. Thousands more in the sack that followed. Perhaps 30,000 were enslaved, taken from the city in chains, sold throughout the Ottoman Empire and beyond, their descendants scattered across the Mediterranean world, carrying memories of Constantinople into lands that had never known Byzantine rule. The city that had been the greatest Christian metropolis in the world was suddenly three-quarters empty, its remaining population shocked into silence, living in the ruins of their civilization. But Mehmed was not interested in ruling over ruins. He needed Constantinople to be a living city again, the capital of his expanding empire, a jewel that demonstrated Ottoman power and sophistication. He issued edicts allowing Greeks to remain, even encouraging those who had fled to return. He appointed a new Orthodox patriarch and gave him authority over the Christian population, recognizing that winning conquered peoples' cooperation required allowing them some autonomy. He brought in Muslim settlers from Anatolia and the Balkans, repopulating the empty neighborhoods, rebuilding what the siege had destroyed. And slowly, gradually, Constantinople became Istanbul, a transformed city, Ottoman in governance but still carrying the bones and memory of Byzantium beneath its new skin. The Peloponnese, the last Byzantine territory outside Constantinople, fell within a few years. The Empire of Trebizond, a Byzantine successor state on the Black Sea coast, survived until 1461 before it too was absorbed into Ottoman dominion. And then there was nothing left. No territory, no government, no emperor. The Roman Empire that had been founded by Augustus in 27 BC had finally, definitively ended after nearly 1,500 years. The political entity was extinct, but the echoes would resonate for centuries. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves through Christian Europe. The news arrived like a funeral announcement, spreading from city to city, bringing grief and fear and guilt. Popes called for crusades to retake the city, but no serious expeditions materialized. Western Europe was too divided, too focused on its own affairs, too accustomed to Byzantine weakness to understand that this time the loss was permanent. Some saw it as divine judgment on the Greeks for their schism and pride. Others recognized it as a catastrophe that made the Ottoman Empire Europe's immediate neighbor, a threat that would dominate European politics for the next 2 centuries. But Constantinople's fall also sparked a kind of rebirth. Byzantine scholars, knowing their world was ending, had been fleeing westward for years, bringing with them manuscripts and knowledge that Western Europe had lost or never possessed. They brought Plato in the original Greek, Homer, the tragedies, the histories, the mathematical and scientific works that had been preserved in Byzantine libraries while Latin Europe struggled through the Middle Ages. The arrival of these texts and the scholars who could teach them contributed directly to the Italian Renaissance, that explosion of learning and art that would transform European culture. In a sense, Byzantium's death seeded its conquerors' lands with knowledge that would eventually empower Europe to surpass the Ottoman Empire that had destroyed it. Russia, meanwhile, claimed to be the inheritor of Byzantine authority. Ivan III of Moscow married Sophia Paleologina, niece of the last emperor, and adopted the Byzantine double-headed eagle as his symbol. Russian thinkers developed the theory of Moscow as the Third Rome. After Rome itself and Constantinople had fallen, Moscow remained as the protector of Orthodox Christianity, the true continuation of the imperial line. It was a claim that would shape Russian identity for centuries, giving the Tsars a sense of world historical mission, a conviction that Russia was destined to be more than just another kingdom but the guardian of a civilization that stretched back to Constantine himself. The Ottoman Empire that emerged from Constantinople's fall was in many ways a continuation of Byzantine administrative practices. The millet system, which organized subjects by religious community rather than ethnicity, resembled Byzantine arrangements. The elaborate court ceremonial that surrounded the Sultan echoed imperial Byzantine protocol. Even the architecture of Ottoman mosques, with their great domes and elaborate decoration, showed Byzantine influence filtered through Islamic aesthetics. Mehmed himself collected Greek manuscripts, employed Byzantine administrators, and styled himself Caesar of Rome, Kaiser Rum, claiming not to have destroyed the Roman Empire but to have become its rightful heir. The memory of Byzantium lingered in ways both profound and subtle, shaping the Orthodox world that survived Ottoman conquest. In monasteries scattered across Greece and the Balkans, on Mount Athos where monks continued their ancient rhythms untouched by political catastrophe, in village churches where peasants worshipped in Greek and Slavonic, the liturgy continued unchanged. The divine liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, which had been chanted in Hagia Sophia for 1,000 years, was chanted still in humbler spaces, carrying forward a living connection to the empire that had fallen. The prayers were the same, the incense smelled the same, the icons gazed out with the same golden stillness. Byzantium might be gone as a political reality, but it survived as a spiritual presence, a way of being Christian that did not depend on emperors or territory. The Greeks under Ottoman rule developed a complex identity, neither fully assimilated nor in open rebellion, finding ways to preserve language and faith and memory through centuries of foreign domination. They told stories about Constantine XI, transforming the last emperor into a legend, the marble emperor who had not truly died but had been turned to marble by an angel at the moment of the city's fall, hidden in a secret chamber beneath the city, waiting for the day when God would awaken him to reclaim Constantinople and restore the empire. It was myth, obviously, a tale told to sustain hope in hopeless circumstances. But myths matter. This one kept alive the conviction that the fall was not permanent, that restoration was possible, that Byzantium would return. Western Europeans, meanwhile, constructed their own Byzantine myth, but it was darker, more contemptuous. To them, Byzantium became a byword for decadence and decline, a civilization that had lasted far too long, growing corrupt and effeminate and overly clever in its long dotage. The word Byzantine itself became an adjective meaning unnecessarily complex or devious. This was deeply unfair, a caricature that said more about Western prejudices than about Byzantine reality, but it stuck. For centuries, historians dismissed Byzantine history as a tedious chronicle of palace coups and theological disputes, not worthy of serious study, merely a sad epilogue to the glory of classical Rome. Only in the last 2 centuries has scholarship begun to recover the real Byzantium from beneath these layers of myth and prejudice. Modern historians recognize now what should have been obvious all along, that an empire lasting over 1,000 years, preserving and transmitting the heritage of classical civilization through the medieval period, holding off wave after wave of invaders while Western Europe struggled to maintain basic literacy, such an achievement deserves respect rather than contempt. Byzantium was not perfect, but it was magnificent in its endurance, creative in its solutions to impossible problems, and essential to the preservation of knowledge that made the later flourishing of European civilization possible. The physical remnants of Byzantine glory are scattered across what was once its territory. In Istanbul, Hagia Sophia still stands, converted back to a mosque in recent years after spending decades as a museum, its Christian mosaics hidden but not destroyed, visible in glimpses where the plaster has fallen away. The walls of Constantinople still march across the landscape, battered but unbroken, testament to the engineers who built them and the countless soldiers who defended them. In Ravenna, Byzantine mosaics glow with colors that have not faded in 1,500 years. In Greek islands and Anatolian valleys, abandoned churches crumble slowly, their frescoes fading as rain and time do their patient work. But the deepest legacy of Byzantium is invisible, woven into the fabric of how millions of people understand themselves and their faith. Orthodox Christianity, which might not have survived if Byzantium had fallen earlier, shapes the spiritual lives of Russians and Greeks and Serbians and Bulgarians and Romanians, connects them to a tradition that predates most of Europe's nations, gives them access to a mystical theology and liturgical beauty that developed in isolation from Western innovations. The theology of icons, the practice of hesychasm, the understanding of theosis, these distinctively orthodox approaches to Christian spirituality are Byzantine inheritances, preserved through centuries and now part of global Christianity's rich diversity. The legal heritage is equally profound. Justinian's codification of Roman law became the foundation for civil law systems across Europe and later the world. The concepts and structures developed by Byzantine jurists, the distinction between public and private law, the emphasis on written codes rather than common law precedent, the ideal of law as a rational system rather than a collection of customs, these shape how most of the world understands justice even now. When people speak of human rights, of legal equality, of justice as a universal principle rather than the will of the powerful, they are using concepts that Byzantine lawyers refined and passed down through the centuries. The empire's military innovations, too, left lasting marks. Greek fire's formula was lost, but the concept of specialized naval weapons influenced later developments. The theme system's combination of military and civil authority, the use of diplomacy as a weapon equal to armies, the sophisticated intelligence networks that kept emperors informed of distant threats, these became models that later states would study and adapt. Byzantine grand strategy, as scholars now call it, was a masterwork of making limited resources stretch impossibly far through clever use of gold, propaganda, and the strategic playing off of enemies against each other. Yet perhaps the most important legacy is the simplest: Byzantium proved that survival itself can be a form of greatness. In an age when empires rose and fell within generations, when the Vandals and Ostrogoths and Avars and dozens of other peoples swept across the stage of history and vanished into obscurity, Byzantium endured. It endured not because it was the strongest or the richest or the most innovative, but because it refused to give up, because generation after generation of Romans, for they never stopped calling themselves Romans, chose to defend the walls and maintain the traditions and preserve the faith even when doing so seemed pointless, even when the rational choice would have been to surrender or flee or accept assimilation into some stronger culture. There is something deeply human in that stubbornness, that refusal to accept the verdict of history. Byzantium should have fallen a dozen times before it finally did. After Heraclius exhausted the empire fighting Persia, after the Arabs took half the territory in a generation, after the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople, after the Black Death ravaged the population, after the Ottomans reduced the empire to a single city, at any of these points, surrender would have been reasonable. But Byzantium did not do the reasonable thing. It continued. It adapted. It found ways to keep the liturgy going, the walls standing, the idea of empire alive even when the empire itself had become more idea than reality. And in the end, when Constantine XI charged into the Ottoman soldiers pouring through the broken wall, when he chose to die as a soldier rather than live as an exile, he was doing what Byzantines had always done. He was refusing the end. He was insisting, with his body and his blood, that Byzantium mattered, that its thousand-year history of defending Christian civilization meant something, that the empire would not slip quietly into the darkness but would make its exit fighting, mourning, but unbroken in spirit. The walls fell. The empire died. But the memory survived. And memory, in the end, is a kind of immortality. As night settles now over the city that was once Constantinople, over the waters of the Bosphorus where Byzantine ships once guarded the passage between worlds, the past whispers still. In the sound of waves against ancient seawalls. In the shadows of structures built when most of Europe was illiterate and scattered. In the prayers that rise from churches where the liturgy has been chanted for over a millennium, the same words and the same cadences, connecting believers now to believers then across the abyss of time. Byzantium fell, yes. But it left something behind that fall could not destroy, a testimony to human resilience, to the power of faith and culture and stubborn love of home to outlast any empire, any conquest, any catastrophe. The last light of Rome flickered out on that May morning in 1453. But lights, once kindled, leave traces long after they are extinguished. In the darkness that followed, people navigated by the memory of that light, found their way using lessons learned in its glow. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all any civilization can hope for, not to last forever, for nothing lasts forever, but to matter enough that its ending changes the world, that its memory becomes a guide for those who come after, that its story is told and retold until the final telling, when the last human voice falls silent and all our empires, all our struggles, all our desperate clinging to meaning and beauty and truth, become at last what they always were, dust and starlight, echoes of echoes, dreams. Dreaming themselves into the infinite quiet of the universe's long night. Sleep well, then. The story is finished. The last of the Romans have gone to their rest. And we, who remember them, can rest too, carrying their memory into our own dreams, where empires rise and fall in the space between heartbeats, and nothing dies that is truly loved.